There's a belief billions of people carry from their first religious instruction. You need redemption. You're born broken, fundamentally flawed, stained by original sin. Your nature is corrupt. Your impulses are wrong. Your thoughts are sinful. Without external salvation, you're damned. You need God's grace, Christ's sacrifice, Church's sacraments to redeem you from your inherent wrongness. The entire framework starts with premise that you're inadequate and ends with promise that proper religious participation might fix you. But here's the unsettling question. What if you were never broken? What if redemption theology exists not to save you, but to create permanent psychological dependency on institutions claiming to provide salvation? Watch what happens to people raised with redemption doctrine. They develop persistent sense of inadequacy that never fully disappears. No matter what they achieve, how moral they are, how much they grow, the core belief remains that they're fundamentally flawed. They can't trust their own judgment because they're corrupt. They can't accept themselves because they're sinful. They can't feel worthy because worthiness must be granted externally through proper religious observance. The redemption they're promised never quite arrives in psychological experience. They remain perpetually broken, perpetually seeking, perpetually dependent on religious framework that created their sense of brokenness in the first place. This creates perfect psychological trap. The solution to feeling inadequate is more religion, more prayer, more confession, more submission, more faith. But the religion itself installed the inadequacy through teaching that you're born wrong and need redemption. It's like selling cure for disease you created. The person never questions whether the disease is real because the institution selling the cure also diagnosed the disease. They just keep pursuing redemption that never fully satisfies because the framework ensures they can never feel complete. There's always more sin to confess, more grace to seek, more redemption to pursue. The inadequacy is permanent, guaranteeing permanent dependence. One philosopher recognized this pattern as Christianity's foundational control mechanism. He understood that telling people they need redemption creates psychological market, where church is sole authorized provider of redemption. If you're told you're fundamentally broken and only specific religious participation can fix you, you're captured. You can't leave because leaving means remaining broken. You can't question because questioning might cost you redemption. You're psychologically imprisoned by belief in your own inadequacy, and by promise that institution holding you prisoner is your only hope of escape. What he discovered wasn't theology about cosmic reality. It was psychological architecture designed to manufacture dependence. The question isn't whether you've made mistakes or whether you could be a better person. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone can grow. The question is whether the premise that you're fundamentally broken and need external redemption serves your growth or prevents it. Because here's what psychology has discovered. Believing you're fundamentally flawed doesn't motivate positive change. It motivates shame, self-hatred, and desperate seeking of external validation. It prevents self-acceptance that's prerequisite for genuine growth. It creates psychological fragmentation where you're always at war with yourself, always trying to redeem inherent wrongness that was installed rather than actual. The redemption you're seeking might be solution to problem that doesn't exist, keeping you perpetually broken, so you'll perpetually seek salvation from those who convinced you that you need saving. Can you handle examining whether you were ever actually broken, or whether brokenness was taught to keep you dependent? Here's what doesn't make sense about redemption as Christianity presents it. The concept wasn't central to early Jewish thought or to Jesus' actual teaching. Ancient Judaism had sin offerings and atonement rituals, yes, but these were for specific transgressions, not for fundamental human corruption. The idea that all humans are inherently sinful from birth doesn't appear in Hebrew Bible. It's Christian innovation, developed particularly by Paul and systematized by Augustine. Jesus himself taught about God's kingdom, about love and justice, about transformation and renewal. He called people to change behavior, to treat others well, to pursue justice. He didn't emphasize that humans are fundamentally corrupt and need external redemption from that corruption. Then something shifted as Christianity developed institutional structure. Original sin doctrine emerged, the idea that Adam's sin is inherited by all humans, making everyone guilty before birth, deserving damnation before committing any personal sin. Augustine formalized this in 4th and 5th centuries, teaching that humans are born depraved, incapable of good without God's grace, justly damned unless God arbitrarily chooses to redeem some through Christ's sacrifice. This wasn't present in earliest Christianity. It was theological development that intensified as Christianity consolidated power and needed mechanisms to make believers permanently dependent on churches' redemptive services. The timing reveals the pattern. Redemption theology intensified exactly when Christianity was transitioning from persecuted minority to state religion managing populations. When church gained institutional power, it needed populations who couldn't function spiritually without institutional mediation. Teaching that you're born broken and need church's sacraments to access God's redemption accomplished this perfectly. You can't be saved alone. You need baptism, administered by authorized clergy. You need confession to authorized priests. You need Eucharist from authorized church. The theology created absolute dependence on institution as intermediary between fundamentally corrupt humanity and redemptive God. Consider also what redemption doctrine emphasizes versus what it ignores. Individual sin requiring redemption gets enormous focus. Sexual thoughts, pride, doubt, minor moral failures. Meanwhile, systemic sin that maintains power structures gets minimized. The wealthy need redemption for individual greed, but not for participating in economic systems causing poverty. The powerful need redemption for personal pride, but not for maintaining hierarchies causing oppression. Nations need redemption for individual citizens' sins, but not for colonial violence and genocide. The pattern shows redemption doctrine focuses on individual inadequacy, while ignoring collective responsibility for structural injustice. This serves power by making people focus inward on personal brokenness rather than outward on systems causing harm. The psychology is revealing. When you believe you're fundamentally broken, you focus energy on fixing yourself rather than changing unjust conditions. You're too busy seeking personal redemption to demand collective justice. You accept exploitation because you're corrupt and deserve nothing better. You submit to authority because authorities at least aren't as depraved as you are. You don't resist oppression because resistance requires confidence in your moral standing, and redemption doctrine destroys that confidence by insisting you're fundamentally wrong. The theology makes people psychologically incapable of challenging power because they've internalized belief that they're too corrupt to deserve better treatment. Nietzsche identified this as Christianity's most sophisticated psychological operation. Don't just punish resistance to power. Make people believe they're too fundamentally flawed to deserve anything good, that any hardship they experience is less than they deserve given their corruption, that their only hope is external redemption from institutions serving power. The person convinced they're worthless accepts worthless treatment. The person convinced they're broken accepts broken conditions. The person convinced they need redemption accepts dependency on whoever claims to provide it. It's not social control through force. It's social control through installed inadequacy. And it's more effective than force because people police themselves through shame rather than requiring external enforcement. What does it mean that doctrine emphasizing your inadequacy emerged exactly when institutions needed you dependent? Friedrich Nietzsche grew up saturated in redemption theology, and the psychological damage shaped his entire philosophical project. His Lutheran upbringing emphasized total depravity, humans as fundamentally corrupt, incapable of good without God's grace, justly deserving damnation. He was taught from childhood that his nature was wrong, his impulses were sinful, his thoughts were corrupt. Every natural desire was suspect as potentially stemming from depravity. Every confident impulse was pride requiring humbling. Every moment of self-acceptance was dangerous delusion about his true corrupt state. He needed constant redemption through constant religious observance to have any hope of salvation from his inherent wrongness. This created profound psychological damage. Nietzsche developed intense shame about his natural impulses, his intellectual confidence, his desire for achievement. He was taught these weren't just excessive or misdirected, they were evidence of fundamental corruption requiring redemption. He couldn't trust himself because himself was inherently untrustworthy. He couldn't accept himself because self-acceptance would be accepting corruption. He couldn't affirm his desires because desires arose from depraved nature. The result was psychological fragmentation where he was constantly monitoring himself for signs of corruption, constantly seeking redemption for being himself, constantly unable to achieve self-acceptance because self-acceptance would mean accepting depravity. The turning point came through his study of ancient Greek culture and philosophy. The Greeks didn't believe humans were fundamentally corrupt or needed redemption from external deity. They believed humans were capable of excellence through developing their nature, through cultivating virtues, through pursuing human flourishing. They had concept of hamartia, missing the mark, making mistakes, but not original sin making you fundamentally wrong. They focused on becoming better versions of themselves, not on redeeming themselves from inherent corruption, and they seemed healthier psychologically, more vital, more self-affirming than Christians obsessed with their own depravity. Nietzsche began investigating systematically in the 1870s and 1880s, particularly in works like On the Genealogy of Morals and The Antichrist. He was examining how Christianity's redemption doctrine functioned psychologically, what it created and what it destroyed, who benefited from populations believing they were fundamentally broken. What he found was that redemption theology didn't describe objective reality about human nature. It installed psychological damage that required the institutional redemption it claimed to provide. It was self-fulfilling. Teach people they're broken. They develop psychology of brokenness, then offer to fix brokenness you created. Perfect business model for religion. What made Nietzsche's analysis so powerful was that he'd lived this psychology from inside. He knew intimately what it felt like to believe you're fundamentally corrupt, to seek redemption constantly, to never achieve self-acceptance because the framework ensures you can't. He understood the appeal. Redemption offers hope of transformation, of becoming acceptable, of finally being okay. But he also recognized the cost. You can never actually achieve that acceptance because the theology ensures you remain broken, so you'll remain dependent. The redemption you're seeking would eliminate your need for the institution providing it, so the institution ensures you never fully receive it. You remain perpetually seeking, perpetually broken, perpetually dependent. The personal stakes were enormous. Rejecting redemption doctrine meant accepting himself as he was, rather than seeking external salvation from what religious framework called corruption. It meant trusting his own nature rather than treating it as fundamentally wrong. It meant self-affirmation rather than self-negation. This was terrifying, because everything he'd been taught said self-acceptance without redemption was damning pride. But continuing to seek redemption meant continuing psychological fragmentation, continuing dependence on framework that kept him broken. He chose self-affirmation over redemption seeking, and that choice launched his philosophy of life affirmation, of saying yes to existence as it is, rather than needing to be redeemed from it. The courage required wasn't just intellectual, it was psychological, choosing wholeness over brokenness, self-trust over institutional dependence, affirmation over redemption. Everything he'd been taught said this choice led to damnation, but the damnation of perpetual brokenness while seeking redemption seemed worse than risking theological damnation by accepting himself. Nietzsche's first concrete evidence came from examining psychological effects of redemption doctrine on believers. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. People who most emphasized needing redemption showed poorest psychological health, highest anxiety, deepest shame, most fragmented self-relationship, least capacity for self-acceptance. They were perpetually monitoring themselves for sin, perpetually seeking forgiveness, perpetually unable to feel okay. The more seriously they took redemption theology, the more psychologically damaged they became. This suggested redemption doctrine wasn't solution to pre-existing problem. It was cause of problem it claimed to solve. This appeared clearly in confession practices. Catholics required to confess sins regularly developed obsessive self-scrutiny, looking for transgressions to confess. They couldn't just live. They had to constantly evaluate whether thoughts and actions were sinful, whether they needed redemption for them, whether they'd confessed adequately. This created psychological state of permanent unworthiness. You could never be clean because the framework ensured you'd always find something requiring redemption. The confession supposedly provided absolution, but it also reinforced message that you're constantly sinning and need constant institutional intervention to address your continuous corruption. Protestant emphasis on salvation by grace alone showed same pattern from different angle. Since you couldn't earn redemption through works, you had to constantly worry about whether you truly had faith, whether you were genuinely saved, whether your election was real. This created different form of same anxiety, not about whether you'd done enough to merit redemption, but about whether you'd received redemption that couldn't be earned. Either way, you remained uncertain, anxious, unable to rest in confidence about your spiritual state. The theology ensured you'd never feel fully redeemed because certainty about redemption might lead to complacency about pursuing more redemption. Nietzsche, found evidence in how redemption-focused people handled mistakes compared to those without redemption framework. When people who believed in fundamental corruption made mistakes, they interpreted them as evidence of their depravity, reinforcing belief that they needed more redemption. The mistakes confirmed the framework. When people without redemption theology made mistakes, they could view them as opportunities for learning and growth without confirming fundamental brokenness. Same mistakes, radically different psychological impacts based on whether framework of redemption and depravity was present. The revealing comparison was with ancient Greek approach to human nature. Greeks believed humans were capable of both excellence and failure, both virtue and vice. When Greeks failed, they worked on developing relevant virtues, cultivating courage to address cowardice, cultivating moderation to address excess. They didn't need redemption from inherent corruption. They needed development of capacities they already possessed. This produced psychology of growth rather than psychology of brokenness. They improved themselves through self-cultivation, not through seeking external redemption from fundamental depravity. And they seemed psychologically healthier, more self-affirming, more confident, more capable of accepting themselves while still striving for excellence. What emerged from this evidence was recognition that redemption theology creates the psychological damage it claims to heal. Tell people they're fundamentally corrupt from birth, and they develop psychology of shame and inadequacy. Then offer redemption from the corruption you taught them to believe in. It's not healing pre-existing condition, it's treating condition you caused. And crucially, the treatment never fully works, because the framework ensures it won't. Full redemption would eliminate need for institutional services. So, theology ensures you never feel fully redeemed. You remain broken, so you'll remain dependent. The evidence shows this isn't accidental failure of theology to deliver what it promises. It's intentional design feature, ensuring permanent market for redemption services. Nietzsche pushed deeper and found specific mechanisms through which redemption theology prevents self-acceptance and maintains dependence. The primary mechanism is splitting human nature into acceptable and unacceptable parts, then demanding redemption to fix the unacceptable parts. But what gets labeled unacceptable isn't objectively harmful. It's whatever threatens institutional control. Natural desires become sins requiring redemption. Intellectual independence becomes pride requiring humbling. Self-confidence becomes arrogance requiring redemption through submission. The framework doesn't identify actual problems needing solution. It pathologizes human nature itself, particularly aspects that might lead to autonomy from institutional authority. This creates impossible bind. You need redemption for being human. Your natural impulses require redemption. Your confident thoughts require redemption. Your self-acceptance requires redemption. But since you can't stop being human, can't eliminate natural impulses, can't avoid thoughts, you need perpetual redemption. You're permanently inadequate, permanently requiring institutional intervention, permanently dependent. The theology doesn't help you become a better person. It prevents you from accepting that you're fundamentally okay person who makes mistakes and can grow. It substitutes growth model with brokenness model, development with redemption seeking, self-acceptance with permanent shame. Nietzsche documented how this operates through language of unworthiness. Christians are taught to call themselves miserable sinners, wretches, unworthy. Church liturgies include repeated confessions of worthlessness. Prayers emphasize inability to do any good without God's grace. The constant verbal reinforcement of inadequacy becomes internalized psychological reality. You don't just believe doctrinally that you're corrupt. You feel it emotionally, experience it psychologically, organize your self-concept around it. The language performs psychological programming, installing sense of brokenness that requires redemption framework provides. The mechanism operates particularly powerfully through making self-acceptance seem sinful. If you accept yourself without seeking redemption, that's pride, the deadliest sin. If you trust your own judgment without submitting to religious authority, that's arrogance requiring humbling. If you affirm your desires without labeling them as corrupt impulses needing redemption, that's worldliness requiring salvation. The framework makes psychological health, self-acceptance, confidence, trust in your own perceptions, into spiritual disease requiring cure through redemption. You can't achieve mental health without committing what the framework calls sin, so you remain mentally unhealthy, trapped between self-acceptance that theology forbids and self-rejection that psychology recognizes as damaging. Nietzsche found evidence of this damage in religious autobiography genre. Saints' writings are full of self-loathing, descriptions of their own corruption, elaborate confessions of unworthiness. This is praised as spiritual maturity. The more you hate yourself, the more spiritually advanced you are. But psychologically, it's textbook pathology. Healthy people don't hate themselves. Healthy people accept themselves while working on real problems. The religious valorization of self-loathing creates framework where mental illness gets coded as spiritual health and actual health gets coded as sinful pride. You're taught to pursue psychology that's recognizably unhealthy while avoiding psychology that would be recognizably healthy. The most disturbing element is how redemption theology handles growth. When you actually do become a better person, more compassionate, more honest, more just, redemption framework attributes this to God's grace, not to your effort or development. You remain fundamentally corrupt. Any good is external addition, not genuine change in you. This means you can never truly grow because the framework ensures the corrupt core remains untouched by improvement. All progress is superficial, all development is temporary, all growth is grace that could be withdrawn. You never become better. You just receive more redemption temporarily covering corruption that remains constant. This prevents genuine psychological development because development requires believing you can change your nature, not just receive temporary covering of unchangeable depravity. What kind of growth model ensures you can never actually grow, only seek perpetual external redemption from what remains constant internal corruption? The pattern Nietzsche uncovered becomes undeniable when you examine who benefits from redemption theology versus who suffers from it. Believers suffer. They develop psychology of shame and inadequacy, remain perpetually dependent on institutional redemption, never achieve self-acceptance. Meanwhile, institutions providing redemption benefit enormously. They have guaranteed customer base who can never stop needing their services because the theology ensures believers never feel fully redeemed. They have psychological control over believers who can't leave without losing access to redemption they've been taught is necessary for salvation. They have financial support from people seeking redemption through religious giving. The asymmetry reveals redemption theology's function. It serves institutions at expense of individuals. This appears clearly in how churches handle doubt. When believer questions redemption theology, they're told doubt itself is sin requiring more redemption. The questioning that might lead to escape gets coded as evidence that you need what you're questioning. It's perfect, self-sealing system. Any movement toward recognizing you don't need redemption gets interpreted as proof you need redemption more desperately. The theology protects itself by making its examination seem like confirming its truth, and believers remain trapped, unable to question, without believing the questioning itself proves their corruption. Consider also how redemption theology handles success versus failure. When believers succeed, they must attribute success to God's grace while emphasizing their own unworthiness. When they fail, they attribute failure to their corruption while seeking more redemption. Either outcome reinforces the framework. Success doesn't build confidence because you didn't cause it. God did despite your unworthiness. Failure destroys confidence because it confirms your corruption. You can never develop healthy self-concept because success is externalized and failure is internalized. The framework ensures you remain dependent, regardless of outcomes. The pattern appears in how differently redemption theology is practiced by authorities versus followers. Church leaders emphasize their own unworthiness in official contexts, but exercise confident authority in practice. They say they're unworthy sinners needing redemption like everyone else, but they position themselves as qualified to provide redemption services, to interpret Scripture authoritatively, to make binding theological judgments. The performance of unworthiness maintains theological consistency while the practice of authority maintains institutional power. They get benefits of confidence while teaching followers to avoid confidence as sinful pride. They live with self-acceptance while teaching followers that self-acceptance requires redemption they provide. Nietzsche identified the economic dimension. Redemption theology creates religious market economy where salvation is product, church is vendor, and human corruption is manufactured demand. Tell people they're broken, they seek fixing. Position yourself as sole authorized fixer, they come to you. Ensure fixing never completes, they keep coming. It's brilliant business model. Create permanent need for product only you can provide by teaching people they have problem that requires your solution. And the solution never fully works, because full solution would eliminate repeat business. The theology isn't designed to successfully redeem people. It's designed to keep them perpetually seeking redemption they never fully receive. The revealing test is imagining Christianity without redemption theology. What if instead of teaching fundamental corruption requiring external salvation, Christianity taught that humans are capable of both good and evil, that mistakes are opportunities for growth, that developing virtue is matter of practice rather than redemption? You'd have religion focused on actual moral development through cultivating compassion, justice, courage, wisdom. You'd have believers who accept themselves while working on real problems. You'd have framework encouraging psychological health rather than installing shame. But you wouldn't have believers perpetually dependent on institutional redemption services. You wouldn't have guaranteed customer base requiring constant intervention. You wouldn't have psychological control over populations taught they're too corrupt to function without religious mediation. The absence of redemption theology would eliminate the dependence that serves institutions even as it damages individuals. The theology persists, not because it's true or helpful, but because it creates dependence that institutions benefit from maintaining. The implications of redemption theology extend into profound and lasting psychological damage affecting millions. When you're taught from childhood that you're fundamentally corrupt, that teaching becomes core belief shaping your entire self-concept. You don't just intellectually believe you need redemption. You feel in your bones that something is deeply wrong with you. This creates foundation of shame that affects everything: relationships, work, creativity, self-expression, capacity for joy. You can't fully engage with life when you fundamentally believe you're broken thing requiring fixing rather than whole person capable of growth. This manifests in how redemption-focused people approach mistakes and failures. Instead of viewing mistakes as learning opportunities, they view them as evidence confirming their fundamental brokenness. Instead of analyzing what went wrong and how to improve, they spiral into shame and self-loathing that theology calls appropriate recognition of corruption. This prevents actual learning and growth. You can't improve if every failure sends you into shame spiral rather than problem-solving mode. The theology makes people less capable of developing because it codes failure as confirming irredeemable corruption rather than as data for improvement. The damage extends to relationships. When you believe you're fundamentally corrupt, you can't be fully authentic with others because you're hiding what you believe is your true worthless self. You perform acceptability while believing your actual self is unacceptable. This prevents genuine intimacy, genuine vulnerability, genuine connection. You're always managing how others see you, terrified they'll discover the corruption you believe lies beneath surface performance. The exhaustion of maintaining this split, acceptable surface-hiding corrupt core, makes authentic relationship impossible. You're never fully present because you're always hiding what you believe is really you. The professional cost appears in how redemption-shaped people approach achievement. They can't fully own their successes because success must be attributed to God's grace rather than their capability. This prevents development of healthy confidence and self-efficacy. They can't learn from experience that they're capable because the theology requires externalizing success while internalizing failure. Meanwhile, they can't take reasonable risks because failure would confirm their corruption. The framework creates paralysis. Can't confidently pursue goals because confidence is pride. Can't learn from success because success isn't really yours. Can't recover from failure because failure confirms your depravity. Nietzsche recognized this as Christianity's deepest spiritual crime, convincing people they're unworthy of their own lives. The person who believes they're fundamentally corrupt doesn't fully inhabit their existence. They're always apologizing for being, always seeking permission to exist, always trying to earn right to their own life through sufficient redemption seeking. They never just are. They're always trying to become acceptable through external validation from redemptive framework. This prevents the spontaneity, the self-affirmation, the confident being that characterizes psychological health. You're not living. You're perpetually auditioning for right to live, and the audition never ends because the theology ensures you never pass. The spiritual cost might be greatest. If spirituality means connecting with something larger than yourself, redemption theology prevents genuine spirituality by making you focus obsessively on your own corruption. You're not experiencing divine presence. You're monitoring yourself for sin. You're not connecting with transcendent reality. You're seeking redemption from supposed corruption. You're not opening to mystery. You're trapped in anxiety about whether you're adequately pursuing salvation. The theology that claims to provide spiritual connection actually prevents it by making you focus on manufactured inadequacy rather than opening to actual experience. Real spirituality requires some acceptance of yourself as you are. Redemption theology ensures you can never accept yourself, meaning you can never achieve genuine spiritual experience, only anxious religious performance, seeking redemption from what you've been taught you are. Here's where Nietzsche's investigation becomes genuinely disturbing. Redemption theology wasn't organic theological development that accidentally created psychological damage. It was strategic construction by people who understood exactly what mechanisms they were building. Augustine's systematic development of original sin doctrine in 4th and 5th centuries coincided precisely with Christianity becoming state religion, needing mechanisms to manage populations. Before Augustine, Christian theology was diverse, with many Christians rejecting idea of inherited sin or human depravity. After Augustine and church councils endorsing his position, original sin became orthodox doctrine, and dissent became heresy. The timing suggests deliberate theological engineering for social control purposes. Church documents reveal explicit awareness of redemption theology's utility for maintaining authority. Medieval theologians wrote about how belief in human corruption makes people dependent on church's redemptive services. Reformation leaders discussed how emphasizing total depravity keeps believers humble and submissive to religious authority. Modern church growth literature discusses how creating sense of need is first step in effective evangelism. Make people feel broken so they'll seek the redemption you offer. This isn't unconscious pattern. It's conscious strategy deployed by people who understand that belief in brokenness creates dependence that serves institutional interests. The pattern accelerated with indulgences in medieval Catholicism. Church literally sold redemption, making financial transaction of the spiritual dependency they'd created. Pay money. Receive temporal reduction of punishment for sins. Advance your redemption. The theology of corruption and redemption became explicit financial model. Luther's objection wasn't to redemption theology itself. He intensified it through total depravity doctrine. His objection was to church profiting financially from redemption it claimed came through grace alone. But both Catholic and Protestant versions maintained the foundational mechanism. Teach people they're broken. Position yourself as providing redemption. Ensure they remain dependent on your services for salvation. Modern evangelical Christianity continues this pattern with remarkable explicitness. Church growth consultants teach pastors to create sense of inadequacy before offering solution. Marketing materials for church programs identify felt needs and explain how to convince people they have needs they didn't know they had, like needing redemption from depravity they weren't aware of before church taught them about it. This isn't presented as manipulation. It's framed as effective ministry. But functionally, it's manufacturing demand for redemption by first creating belief in brokenness, requiring redemption. It's salesmen creating problem your product solves. The truly disturbing element is how this operates through sincere believers. Most pastors genuinely believe redemption theology, genuinely think they're helping people by teaching about corruption and redemption. They're not consciously manipulating. They're transmitting theology they received that shapes how they see themselves and others, that they believe is true description of human condition. But their sincere belief doesn't change functional outcome. Populations believing they're fundamentally broken, dependent on institutional redemption, psychologically damaged by theology claiming to heal them. The system perpetuates through true believers who can't see they're agents of mechanism that creates dependency it claims to resolve. Nietzsche identified this as Christianity's most cynical operation. Those providing redemption caused the need for it by teaching people they were broken. They diagnosed disease, sold cure, ensured cure never fully worked, so disease remained chronic condition, requiring perpetual treatment. And they did this while genuinely believing they were serving God rather than serving institutional interests that depended on believers remaining dependent. The question isn't whether every church leader understands this consciously. It's whether the pattern persists because it serves institutional survival, regardless of individual intentions. Redemption theology creates and maintains dependency that benefits institutions providing redemption services. That's not theological truth about human nature. That's business model for religion. The question emerges, if Nietzsche exposed redemption theology as creating the dependency it claims to resolve, why isn't this widely understood? Why do millions still believe they're fundamentally corrupt and need external redemption? The answer reveals how effectively the theology protects itself through multiple reinforcing mechanisms. The primary defense is that questioning redemption theology is itself framed as proving you need redemption. If you doubt you're fundamentally corrupt, that doubt is diagnosed as pride, the core sin proving your corruption. If you suggest you don't need redemption, that's ultimate arrogance, demonstrating how desperately you need it. The framework is perfectly self-sealing. Any questioning gets reinterpreted as confirming what's being questioned. You can't escape by examining whether the premise is true, because examination itself is treated as evidence the premise is true. The person who thinks they don't need redemption is most in need of it, because thinking that is ultimate pride. The second defense is psychological comfort, despite psychological damage. Redemption theology provides explanation for your struggles and promise of solution. You struggle because you're corrupt. You can overcome struggles through redemption. This is simpler than accepting that life is complex, that struggles are normal, that growth requires difficult work without guaranteed salvation. Believing you need redemption at least provides framework, provides hope, provides sense that your problems have spiritual solution. The alternative, that you're fundamentally okay person facing normal human challenges requiring practical work rather than redemption, feels less comforting even though it's healthier psychologically. The third defense is social consequences. In religious communities, rejecting redemption theology marks you as dangerously proud, possibly lost, threatening to others' faith. You face isolation, relationship loss, community rejection. For people whose entire social structure is church-based, the cost of questioning redemption is losing everything. So most suppress their doubts, maintain belief, never voice the obvious observation that constantly seeking redemption for fundamental brokenness hasn't made them whole. This prevents collective questioning that might destabilize the system. Each doubter thinks they're alone, keeping quiet to maintain belonging while others do the same. Modern resistance follows these patterns precisely. When you suggest redemption, theology creates the damage it claims to heal. Believers respond that you're prideful, that you're denying human sinfulness, that you're risking salvation through arrogance. The emotional intensity reveals what's being defended. It's not just theological doctrine, it's entire psychological framework, organizing their self-concept, their relationships, their meaning-making. Acknowledging they don't need redemption means acknowledging they've organized life around belief in brokenness that was taught rather than real, that they've sought solution to problem that didn't exist, that the institution they've trusted to provide redemption actually created need for it. That's unbearable realization. The most effective suppression is that few people experience contrast that would reveal the damage. If everyone you know was taught redemption theology, if your entire community shares belief in fundamental brokenness, you have no basis for recognizing this is unusual or harmful. You think constant shame is normal spiritual state. You think perpetual inadequacy is appropriate recognition of your nature. You think inability to self-accept is proper humility. You never encounter alternative where people accept themselves without needing redemption. Develop ethically through practice rather than through seeking salvation. Treat mistakes as learning opportunities rather than as evidence of corruption. So you can't recognize that your psychology isn't human nature. It's result of installed theology. The system persists because questioning it proves you need it, because it provides comfort despite causing damage, because doubting it isolates you, because its ubiquity prevents recognition that it's unusual. Redemption theology survives not because evidence supports it, but because it's engineered to resist examination, because damaged psychology it creates makes people cling to promise of redemption, even as redemption never arrives, because those benefiting from believers' dependence present the dependence as spiritual truth rather than as manufactured need-serving institutional interests. The theology that claims to save you is the reason you believe you need saving, but recognizing that requires psychological strength the theology systematically undermines. The final question isn't whether you've made mistakes or whether you could grow. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone can develop. The final question is whether believing you're fundamentally broken and need external redemption helps you grow or prevents you from accepting yourself enough to genuinely grow. And the evidence is overwhelming. Redemption theology doesn't heal pre-existing brokenness. It creates sense of brokenness that requires the redemption it provides. It's not solution. It's the problem disguised as solution. What Nietzsche understood that most people still don't You were never fundamentally broken. You're human, which means you're capable of both good and harmful actions, both wisdom and foolishness, both compassion and selfishness. This is normal human complexity, not corruption requiring redemption. When you make mistakes, you need reflection and adjustment, not salvation from fundamental depravity. When you cause harm, you need to make amends and change behavior, not seek redemption from corrupt nature. When you struggle psychologically, you need understanding and growth, not institutional intervention for spiritual brokenness. The redemption you've been seeking addresses problem that was installed by the same framework offering redemption. The practical path forward requires distinguishing between actual problems and manufactured inadequacy. Actual problems are specific. You lost your temper and hurt someone. You made decision that caused harm. You have behavioral pattern that needs changing. These are addressable through reflection, amends, practice, growth. Manufactured inadequacy is a global. You're fundamentally corrupt. Your nature is wrong. You need redemption for being you. This isn't addressable because it's not actual problem. It's installed belief that creates perpetual need for solution that never arrives because the problem is your existence itself. Start with radical experiment. What if you're fundamentally okay? Not perfect, not incapable of harm, not beyond growth, but fundamentally okay. What if your mistakes are mistakes, not evidence of cosmic corruption? What if your desires are natural human impulses that require ethical engagement, not sinful corruptions requiring redemption? What if your doubts are healthy questioning, not spiritual disease? What if self-acceptance isn't pride but psychological health? What if you don't need external redemption because you're not broken in ways requiring saving? This doesn't mean abandoning ethics or growth. It means grounding ethics in actual harm rather than theological corruption. Grounding growth in development rather than redemption seeking. You can pursue being a better person without believing you're fundamentally bad person. You can work on real problems without accepting that you're cosmically broken. You can develop ethically without needing institutional salvation. In fact, you can do these things better without redemption framework because you're not paralyzed by shame, not dependent on external validation, not trapped in cycle of seeking redemption that never arrives. Some people find that releasing redemption theology allows them to develop healthier spirituality based on self-acceptance and growth rather than on shame and salvation seeking. They discover they can connect with transcendent reality without believing they're too corrupt to deserve connection. Others find that without redemption framework, religious structure stops making sense entirely, that their faith depended on believing they were broken and needed institutional fixing. Still others develop secular ethics focused on actual well-being rather than on redemption from theoretical corruption. The destination matters less than the honesty of examining whether redemption belief serves your growth or prevents it. Nietzsche's invitation wasn't to predetermined conclusion about theology. It was to examine whether believing you need redemption helps you or keeps you dependent, whether the institutions teaching you about redemption benefit from your continued belief in brokenness, whether the inadequacy you feel is actual or installed. If you can't question redemption theology without experiencing that questioning as confirming your need for redemption, that reveals the self-sealing trap. If examining costs and benefits feels like dangerous pride, that shows how the framework protects itself from investigation. Real growth requires some self-acceptance as foundation. You can't develop from place of believing you're cosmically broken. Redemption theology prevents that foundation by ensuring you never accept yourself, never trust yourself, never affirm yourself. It keeps you perpetually broken so you'll perpetually seek redemption from those who taught you that you're broken. The redemption they're offering is from brokenness they installed. The salvation they're providing is from problem they created. The healing they're promising addresses damage their theology caused. You are not fundamentally corrupt. You are not cosmically broken. You are not inherently depraved. You are human, complex, capable of both good and harm, able to learn and grow, deserving of the self-acceptance that redemption theology systematically denies you. The mistakes you've made are mistakes, not proof of depravity. The growth you need is development, not redemption. The healing you seek is self-acceptance, not external salvation from manufactured brokenness. The architecture of redemption theology was designed to create permanent dependency by installing permanent inadequacy. But you're not required to maintain beliefs installed by institutions serving their own interests. You can examine whether the brokenness you've been taught to believe in is real. or whether its mechanism creating need for redemption those institutions provide. You can investigate whether seeking redemption has made you whole or kept you fragmented. You can ask whether the salvation you're promised ever actually arrives, or whether arrival is prevented by theology, ensuring you remain perpetually broken. The redemption you've been seeking all your life? You don't need it, not because you've achieved it through proper religious observance, but because you were never actually broken in the ways you were taught to believe. The corruption requiring redemption was installed, not discovered. The brokenness was taught, not inherent. The inadequacy was manufactured to create market for redemption services. You are the redemption you always sought, not because you became adequate through seeking, but because you were adequate all along and were taught otherwise to keep you dependent. Are you ready to accept yourself without needing redemption? Or will you keep seeking salvation from brokenness that was installed to ensure you never stop seeking? The choice is yours, but the person you're trying to redeem through endless religious effort is already whole, already capable, already worthy, the only redemption needed is redemption from the belief that you need redemption, and that redemption doesn't require church, prayer, or salvation. It requires recognizing that the brokenness was taught, not true, that you were always okay, that self-acceptance isn't pride, it's recovery from theological damage, that you are right now in this moment fundamentally enough, not perfect, not incapable of growth, but fundamentally, inherently, completely enough. The redemption is recognizing you never needed redemption. You just needed permission to accept yourself. Consider this permission granted.